mysterious. So, do you believe in Bigfoot yet? Come on now. We got more reported, credible, documented sightings of Bigfoot than we have of wild cats, like mountain lions and such, in this country. Not to mention the rest of the world. Why the government or whoever it is that wants to keep this covered up, wants to keep it covered up? Your guess is as good as mine. Either way, I got some real good stories in store for you today. Hit that subscribe button and check out my playlist if you visit my channel. If you click on the little icon that leads you to my channel, I do have a playlist called All Episodes. Hit that, hit play, and check them on out. Let's jump into our first story of today's episode. This one comes to us from Edward. Edward is a resident of Oregon. As I told you when we first spoke, I was hunting solo on October 1st, 2003. Working my way up through the Willamette National Forest and nearing the fringes of the Three Sisters Wilderness. I was breaking out of some heavy timber and coming into an area where I was faced with a low, mountainous terrain on three sides. To my northeast, there was a very distinct ridgeline sloping down from a peak that was in view directly in front of me, and I was making my way through the thinning timber. I noticed what happened to be a pile of branches heaped up between several large trees. The pile appeared to be shaped kind of like a dome, being about 12 feet tall. This was extremely unusual, very unusual thing to run across. I'd never seen anything like it in all my days of hunting. So, quite naturally, I went over to investigate. Nearing this structure, it very much resembled a roughly built Quonset hut, and it had a large opening on one side of it. I could immediately tell this structure had been assembled and did not occur randomly by some act of nature. With predominantly large pines in this area, the nature of this forest did not lend itself to a large quantity of fallen branches being on the ground, let alone a pile of branches falling together to form a 12-foot tall heap below the trees, kinda sorta shaped like an igloo. Looking through the opening of the structure, which was about 6 feet tall and some 4 feet wide, I could see other tree boughs which were laid out and covering the entire interior of the hut, about 2 feet deep. There were more than a few animal bones scattered about in the interior too. So that right there is a telltale sign this wasn't an accident of nature. I have to tell you that I was more than a little puzzled by what I was seeing. My initial thoughts were that some hunter or hunters had gone through quite a bit of trouble to put this together as a shelter when in the area, but that thought was trumped by the bones inside. It's not as though there are cavemen living here, gnawing on dinosaur legs in the confines of their hut. I stepped back, withdrawing my head from the inside of the hut, when for some reason I felt as though I was being watched. Call it intuition or a sixth sense or whatever the heck you want to call it. I felt a pair of eyes were burning a hole in my flesh. I was hunting that day with a vintage M1 carbine with a clip. As this feeling of being watched was overwhelming my senses, I started to scan the surrounding area. My eyes were drawn to something dark on the ridgeline. This something was not there before. The distance was far too great to estimate how tall it was or even what it was, but in my estimation at the time, it was certainly something standing upright and in all black. My first thought was that of a hunter dressed in dark clothing who happened to be walking the ridge and noticed me below, stopping to have a look at his fellow hunter. But this was about to change, and change dramatically. Suddenly, without warning, this man, or whatever it was, broke from its position on the ridge and began running down the slope, heading in my direction. This ridge had to have been several thousand feet in elevation and was clear of any brush or trees. Exactly how far away it was from my position was indiscernible. I realized, within the first 15 seconds or so, that there was absolutely no way this was a man. I say this because of the amount of ground that was being covered and how quickly it was running down the slope. In no more than 30 seconds, it must have descended 1,000 feet and was closing rapidly. This was not and could not be a man. If I were to descend that same slope, I would have had to do so slowly and cautiously. It would probably take me an hour. Within about 90 seconds, this creature, which I was convinced was a Sasquatch, was at the base of the mountain and running straight at me. At the time, I had estimated the distance to be between 600 and 900 yards between myself and the mountain's base. I had no scope on my gun, and this thing was barreling straight towards me like a freight train. I had an 8-round clip in my rifle. I lowered the gun, pointed it above the head of the coming beast, and squeezed off my first round. The shot rang out with a loud blast echoing against the mountains, but the beast kept coming. It was close enough now where I could see the movements of its arms. Do you remember the scene in the Terminator movie when the robot cop was chasing the car and was running with the arms pumping at an incredible and unrelenting pace? That's exactly what I was seeing. I knew that if I didn't kill this thing, I was a dead man. Putting the sight right on him, I squeezed off rounds 2 and 3, but he kept coming. I couldn't believe what was happening. I began to tremble violently. I only had 5 rounds left. I was sure I hit him with the last 2, but they had no effect whatsoever. He kept running. I leaned against the tree, steadying my shaking hands and the gun, and squeezed off round 4. Nothing. He was now maybe 100 yards. Close enough, I could make out the details of his body. As I pulled the trigger on bullet number 5, he dropped to the ground. Having only 3 rounds left in the clip, I took the opportunity to quickly reload as the beast lay unmoving before me. With my clip reloaded, I slowly began approaching this monster with my gun mounted and pointed directly at it. I was stalking it like a Marine approaching an enemy foxhole, expecting it to rise to its feet at any moment and resume its attack. When I was within about 100 feet, I put 2 more rounds into it and finished the job. When I came to within about 20 feet of the monster, it was unmoving and very much dead. I fell to my knees. Both physically and mentally, I felt as though I had finished a marathon. My body was completely drained of energy and tears started to roll down my cheeks. For what reason, I don't know. As it lay before me, the Sasquatch was all of 10 feet long and possibly 1,500 to 2,000 pounds or more. No way of knowing. Its fur was soaked in blood now, and there was blood trickling out of his mouth. How could it have kept such a pace after being hit so many times by a .308 bullet? That's not a small bullet. I was quite sure that 3 of these rounds hit the creature in the chest, with the 5th bullet finishing the job. If I had brought my bolt action on that day, I don't believe that I'd be alive to tell this tale. This hut that I had run across had obviously belonged to this creature, and it was none too happy about my being there. The way it was running at me appeared as though it was on a kill and destroy mission, and I wasn't going to waste any time waiting to be on the receiving end of its wrath. Nevertheless, I was somewhat afraid at the time of the potential repercussions for my actions that day. I left the beast right where it had dropped and retreated out of the woods. I still can't believe the size and scope of this creature. How it's even possible these things exist? I'm still trying to figure out for myself. I wasn't about to wait around for the immediate family to arrive with vengeance on its mind and a taste for my blood. The beast, as it laid before me, was covered in dark brown hair. Its face did not look human, but it didn't look like that of a monkey. It simply looked like a Sasquatch. To me, it's not a hybrid of anything. It's its own entity, being completely and solely what it is and nothing else. At any rate, that is what I both saw and shot that day in the Oregon wilderness. Whew, that one will get your adrenaline going. Can't even imagine. Holy smokes. I know that gun very well. I'm a proud owner of an M1A SOCOM 16. It's actually one of my favorite hunting rifles. I know it's more of a sporting rifle style, military style, but it shoots a .308 or a 7.62 NATO, and you know it is a great hunting rifle. But for him to shoot all them rounds and that thing to not even flinch, I mean, I can't even imagine. I mean, I would think the last round must have been a headshot, which he doesn't say. He says it they all hit him in the chest, but I don't know. You hit him in the chest, it doesn't knock you out immediately. If a headshot would throw you straight to the ground, but chest, you'd bleed out. Like an animal, you shoot a deer, they run while they're bleeding. I'm sorry if this is gruesome for those of y'all that don't hunt, but anyway, it's not a little bullet. Not the biggest one out there, but it's not a little bullet. One of them would put a human down real fast, especially with a straight shot to the torso. Even if you didn't hit any vitals, that is not a small round. All right, let's get into our next one. This one's good too. This one comes to us from Ricky, and he is out of Northern California, And his story was back in 2002. And here's what Ricky has to say. This sighting occurred while we were on the hunt. Okay, another hunter. On the fringes of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. More or less in the Trinity Alps wilderness at the time. By California standards, the day was dark and dreary as we made our way through the timber. The two of us had decided to pause for a rest on a high point overlooking the wooded ravine. It was at the top of a downward sloping hillside with the same type of configuration occurring across the way from us, forming a ravine in the middle. We could tell by the nature and appearance of many of the trees that this portion of the forest had fell victim to a wildfire at some point in the past. Many of the trees' trunks showed evidence of being scorched by a blaze. More than a few had broken off through the years, having died in the conflagration. The two of us were sitting perhaps some 200 or 300 feet above the bottom of this ravine. Even though we hadn't had any success thus far in our day, our position was well concealed, ever hopeful that opportunity would come knocking. And knock it did. It was after about 30 or 40 minutes when we heard several loud thuds. Having seen nothing and only being able to rely on what we were hearing, it was extremely difficult to put a label on what we had heard, as well as what could have made the noise. Neither of us had heard anything like it before, in the woods or while hunting. There were so many trees covering the slope, both below us and surrounding us, that our visibility was poor at best, pertaining to be able to see anything moving. Some 10 minutes later, we heard yet again a number of these loud but dull-sounding thuds being made. But this time, they sounded somewhat closer. From our position, there were a few of what I'll describe as alleyways through the trees. They were staggered viewpoints through the trees that were occasionally broken up by the boughs of a tree coming across them. Having said that, there were numerous points where if something had crossed one of these alleyways, we could see it, even if it was but briefly. Again, after about 10 or 15 minutes, we heard the same noise. Only this time, we both agreed that it sounded like somewhat of a slap against wood. I had no way of quantifying what it was at the time, but it sounded like something smacking a log and its bark. It was definitely not wood hitting wood. The question was, of course, who or what would be slapping trees in the forest and for what reason? And it was then that in one of these broken alleyways that I was just describing to you, at the distance of about 200 feet from us, we saw a large dark figure move across the opening. It was very brief, but we saw it, and we were now watching with great intent, looking in the direction it had headed. Now maybe 40 or 50 feet away from us, we had seen this figure. There was another slight break in the trees, and there was standing a large, well-decayed and burnt remnant of an old large pine. What was left of the tree was about 20 feet tall, and the top was broken off, with the trunk being some 20 inches or more in diameter. The two of us were crouching very low, and aside from our being able to see, we were completely concealed from view. Suddenly, a huge Sasquatch came into view and began to survey the tree that I just described. It was rubbing the tree with its hand, looking at it with what appeared to be great interest. The Sasquatch then began to slap the dead tree with its open palm. Again and again, it was smacking the tree. In between each slap, it placed its ear against the trunk, like it was hugging it and listening. At this point, it seemed to get somewhat excited and grasped the tree with both hands, beginning to shake it violently. Seconds later, the tree broke loose from its remaining roots in the soil and came crashing down to the ground. As soon as the tree had hit the ground, the Sasquatch leaped towards the broken top and fell to its knees. It was reaching into what must have been a hollow in the tree's trunk. While continuing to slap the tree with its other hand repeatedly and violently, it banged on the tree with blow after blow, smashing against its bark. And then, in what I can only describe as an act of frustration, the beast growled loudly, grabbed the tree with both hands while kneeling, and began to slam it up and down against the ground. Suddenly, its arm moved like a flash, and in its hand, it held a wriggling possum. He seemed to dispatch it quickly with just a squeeze of its hand. The Sasquatch dropped the dead possum and began to bang the log up and down again and again on the ground. This time, he leapt to his feet while turning away from us in an apparent pursuit of yet another possum that had emerged from the tree. Frankly, we could not believe what we were seeing. About 2 minutes had passed, and the creature returned, dropping another possum on the ground. Having apparently been successful in capturing it, it resumed wrestling with the tree trunk. This went on for several more minutes, until it appeared to be satisfied that there were no more critters to be had from the tree's interior. It then stood to its feet, bending down to retrieve its 2 victims, and disappeared into the woods. The tree, albeit very dead, had to have weighed hundreds of pounds, and this beast, from a kneeling position, was slamming it up and down like you or I would a bed pillow. We now knew, from seeing it with our own eyes, that this is what we had been hearing up until this point. We actually saw it for ourselves. It was walking through the woods, slapping and listening to trees for any activity inside, in the form of creatures living in them as a den. Who knew? The Sasquatch had simply squashed the opossum and killed it. The possum, which seemed to be fairly large for its kind, appeared like a sandwich in its hand. When the Sasquatch stood to its feet, it was at least all of 10 feet tall or better. The absolutely massive sense of this creature I can't even describe. In all its proportions, the skin on its hands and face appeared to be somewhat dark in coloration. It seemed leathery, thick. I don't know, I can't explain it. And its fur appeared to be almost black. At about 200 feet, it could have been hair, but we couldn't tell. It was, however, relatively long and quite matted in its appearance. And there you have it. That was our Sasquatch sighting. Wow, well, I greatly appreciate that, Ricky. And I appreciate you all for hanging out and listening. What do you think of those ones? Have you ever had a Bigfoot encounter? Do you know anybody that has seen Bigfoot? Do you know that I have a son that had an up-close and personal Bigfoot encounter here in Florida? That's the fact. Well, if you've had an encounter, I'd appreciate it and love hearing it. If you'd shoot me an email, tell me your story. We could talk a little bit about it, and, if it's up to you, but maybe I'll turn it into an episode. Drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com. I appreciate y'all. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And I will see y'all in the next one.